It's podcast day. It's podcast day. Welcome in, friends. Lovely humans. It is actually me, Mars. Some of you have not seen me in spectacles before. I recently went for an eye exam, as one does, and turns out that I need these readers. So it is me, Mars. Hey BrownBerry, welcome to the channel. I actually was using these because below this camera is my spinning wheel. I was doing some spinning. And I am finding them to be very helpful for all things fiber related. Even looking down at my fiber as I'm drafting it on the spinning wheel is made better by being able to see. Can you imagine? And it certainly has been helpful for knitting, sock knitting in particular. And so I'm very grateful. I'm grateful to have the privilege to go and have somebody look at my eyes and tell me, you need a little help. Welcome into this episode. This is going to be kind of a vlog-like episode because I wanted to share with you a recent project, which is not fiber related, but fabric. And since this is a maker podcast and I talk about making and my reflections on making, I figured you'd be okay with me sharing a sewing project. Yes? So just in case the baby readers are making it hard for any of you to see me properly, I'll put these away. It is a weekend here and I have come to really appreciate weekends. Actually, I'm going to take out my little headphones as well, just in case I'm messing up the audio by not being able to hear my own self talking. I've really come to appreciate weekends, and by that I mean I've always loved a weekend because a Saturday and a Sunday feel like they have more hours in them. Do you know what I mean? We know they don't technically have more hours in them, but they are not as often filled with commitments and scheduled things. So I'm enjoying my weekends more and more as I get smarter and wiser in my older age. And I tend to still fill mine with things and schedule things, but they are things that are directed by me. And a couple weekends ago, I spent some time sewing. Now, sewing for me, when I talk about it, I have this little inner voice that says, yeah, you sew, Mars, but you don't capital S, sew. Do you ever have that with any of your particular craft projects where you feel like you can only use the small letter, so I small s sew? But I try to quiet that voice because a sewing machine and thread and fabric are involved. I'm sewing. And there's no reason to diminish that activity. But I have a lot of trepidation around it because I'm just not as experienced with it. And because I'm not as experienced with it, I'm not that great at it. I have sewn many things in the past that felt manageable. So I've even made project bags that I sold to other people that I feel very proud of, because sewing pouches and bags is something I really enjoy. And because I really enjoy it, I spent a lot of time doing it. And it's kind of the thing that I go back to when I want to get back to my machine. I will pick out some fabric and make a drawstring bag or a zippered bag. But of course, sewing has so many paths you can pursue, right? Specifically, I have trepidation, I have fear, I have hesitation around garment sewing. And it just so happens that I'm wearing one of the things I have sewn. I'll stand up so you can see. This, a very simple garment, is the Patricia Camilla Pinafore. And I've talked about it on the podcast in the past. It is from a sewing pattern by my friend Ellen Mason. And I'll make sure that Ellen's information and her sewing patterns are available to you by a link below. So I've sewn this garment through a process working with a friend of mine, Jenny, of stitching along together on something that felt challenging for us. And I'm really proud of it. It's a chambray material that has held up very well in the wash. I learned new seaming techniques. I feel like the fit is great. This back detail, you can see that. I'm in love with all of it. It took me a really long time, and when I say a long time, I mean months to get through the full process. My impression of these fears and hesitations I have, my impression of my own issue with sewing is I don't feel like I have a very natural spatial awareness. And sewing for your body really involves a lot of geometry and shapes, and it's a real skill to be able to fit an item to your body, even when you're following a really good pattern like this one. And so when I get to the machine and I have two pieces of fabric that need to come together in a shape, a bag presents less of a mental challenge for me. I know that in the hesitation around garments, there's a lot of body stuff, right? Sewing something to fit my body can bring up body issues and thoughts, but it's also something that touches on my fear of waste and not necessarily being comfortable cutting into fabric and hoping that I've done it correctly and according to the instructions. I'm fearful of wasting the fabric by not doing those steps correctly. So I took a long time to digest the pattern and then cut out the pieces and then assemble them. Ellen's patterns are, in my opinion, exceptional, even for beginners. It's like having her with you at the machine. And the pro tips and side comments within the pattern were right on time for me. And I think the finished garment is the evidence that it's totally doable. But each time I go to the sewing machine, there is a mental ramp up that I do. And there's a lot of talking to myself and pep talking to myself specifically because, again, I'm afraid of waste. I am not as comfortable. I don't do it very often. So that means anytime I go to my sewing machine to make a project, I'm taking out all my tools. I'm gearing up. And it's not like my knitting, which is always, an arm's reach from me. There's something to it. Are any of you beginning sewers out there or, dipping into the world of quilting or something like that? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it's like for you each time you approach your sewing machine. And what about hand stitchers, which feels like a whole other level to me, to get good at stitching with just thread and needle and your hands and not having the speed and the consistency that I find on the sewing machine. Hand stitching is just something I heavily admire, but it seems far off to me. I've done little bits here and there, and I can't at the moment fathom a hand-stitched garment. But if you're a hand stitcher, shout me out in the comments below what you love about it. Like anything, my sewing project recently came somewhat intuitively, and I'm fortunate that I have the materials here, so I could almost always decide to just pick up and start sewing. I go through the process and I take some time afterwards to say, why am I having a hard time with this? Or what do I enjoy about this or not enjoy? I'm trying to do more of that reflection, as you know, if you have visited me before. And also, as with anything, I usually feel really good when it's done. There have been times when I've made something and at the end, I just kind of shake my head and say, not really happy with any of the process or the outcome. But for the most part, I'm happy with how it turns out, as with this bag. So you're seeing some video of me sharing the process and the steps to make this bag. You want to be on my podcast? Say hi. So when you're in here talking to yourself on the camera, sometimes so people stop by. This is my husband, Andrew. You're going to be on YouTube.
I don't like my voice or my face.
I like your voice and your face. So, and it's my podcast.
I like my face, but not when it's on camera like that.
Well, I think it looks really good. Thanks for visiting me. We were talking about sewing. This project came about because I had saved a tutorial for making a tote bag, and it just caught my eye on YouTube because I get great recommendations for things I might be interested in. And I saved it to my YouTube watch later list, and as I was going through that on the weekend, I saw it and I thought, I am going to follow this tutorial and let all the energy that this particular wonderful podcaster has put into the tutorial be the thing that carries me through the process. And so I went through step by step. It did take me a couple of days because I got to a point on day one where I thought this is a good stopping point. I don't want to start rushing. And so on the second day, I finished it up. The link to the tutorial I followed is in the description box below this video, by the way, and I can actually highly recommend it. In fact, I would make this particular tote again in different fabrics, maybe with some fabric handles. I recommend it if you're looking for a fairly easy to follow step-by-step tutorial for a tote bag. So going through the process of choosing the fabric and taking my time to do things like iron open my seams and, really take care with measuring, brought to mind some of the things that tend to make sewing difficult for me. Because I have knit for many years, I find a lot of the startup process for knitting to be very easy. I'm able to sit down with a skein of yarn and some needles and just go. I can start. And even if I might be challenged by a knitting pattern or a crochet pattern, many of the steps are familiar enough to me that they don't feel like an obstacle. Hey friends, I hope you've been enjoying this little project. Stitch along with me. I started this process a couple days ago, or yesterday. I can't remember. Time is weird. Anyway, I originally wanted to share the steps with you because I like doing that here. But I also wanted to record myself stepping through a sewing project. So by now you've heard me talking about this project, and I've raved about the tutorial I was following. At least I hope I have at this point. And I am in the finishing stage. I have the outer fabric and lining fabric of my bag stitched together. And I'm at the step that I thought was worth recording, where I'm going around the edges. I'm right by the window, so the light is fantastic. I'm going around the edges of the bag, and at the top edge, where the outer fabric and inner fabric meet, it's one of those places in a project like this that I have skimped and skipped steps in the past. This is a tote bag. I don't plan on selling it. I really went into this project with the idea that I just wanted to flex my stitching muscle, use my machine. And in the past, that would be my excuse when I get to this finishing step to just put this under the machine and be done with it. Top stitch is the next step. And in the tutorial, wonderful human who is offering this free public information said that her method is to turn the bag inside out and stitch from this lining side. I never do that, but I'm doing it because I love the way her bag turned out. And she does a double top stitch. So 1/8 of an inch top stitch from the edge and then a 1/2 inch top stitch from the edge. I never do that, but I'm going to. And most importantly, at least most impactful to me, she clips around the edges as a way to really keep that junction between the two layers laying flat as she goes around in top stitches. I never do that. And I know for a fact that in the past, I have looked at the top edge of my bag, even after top stitching, and thought, oof, I really wish that was a bit neater, and I really wish I was the kind of person who would sew and not have so many regrets after the end of the project. The reality is, it's not something I need to wish for, it's just something I need to do differently. And in short, it comes back to the same old thing. I just need to slow down. This is not a production item. There is no deadline. And I can take the extra mumble number of minutes to clip the edges together so that when I do the top stitch, they are laying flat and look lovely. And I can avoid that whole I wish I had step at the end. That's what we're doing today. Thank you so much for being here with me while I go through this project. It was somewhat of a spur of the moment. I had saved the YouTube video for making this bag to my watch later list. I saw it pop up as I was looking at things to get into this weekend. And it was a reminder that at some point I thought it would be a good idea. So I feel really good about the follow-through part of that. But I also am just patting myself on the back a tiny bit for taking a bit more time with this one. And I'm not gonna lie, it helps that I could share it with you. While sewing this bag, I took care this time to measure twice, cut once, right? That's kind of an old adage, a common saying. I took the time to measure properly each piece. I took the time to iron my seams. And even when I was at the machine, I took the time to change out my bobbin thread to match the colors I wanted and to stitch. Not slowly. I don't feel like I was plodding along at the machine, but to stitch in a way that was more mindful. Because in the past, when I have not done those things I just mentioned, then the item doesn't come out looking that great. And unfortunately, I then connect that to the whole experience. So it doesn't look the way that I wanted. It's not as tidy. It's not as neat. I'm not happy with the stitching or the finish. And then it kind of colors the whole experience that I don't like it. I didn't enjoy it. I don't like how it looks. It feels like I've wasted my time and I've wasted fabric. So being more mindful this time, and honestly really just trying to enjoy the whole experience as a kind of a retreat into making. I had an instructor by way of YouTube, I had my materials, I had space, and I had time. I was treating it like a retreat making moment. And again, a lot of these steps in the sewing process are not intuitive to me. So it's not a thing where I really just sink into my own intuition for the next step and the next step. I was following this tutorial one instruction at a time, checking my work, rewind, listen again, do the action, check my work. So in that way, it wasn't like being in some kind of unconscious flow, but it still felt very much like a mindful experience. And reflecting back on it now, I really enjoyed it, and it showed in the finish. It showed in the outcome. I would like to do this kind of study and slow approach with a few things. I loved it for this sewing experience because I made a thing that is useful to me. Put some yarn in there. It's almost like a almost ready to go project with some yarn set up inside the bag. And I feel like the bag is well made and that I can tote it around with me around the house or out in the world. And the study approach, where I just decided to move through the steps without adding too much noise from my head, felt really good. And there are other things that I want to approach that way. I'm considering punch needle. Have you heard about punch needle? Of course you've heard about punch needle. It's like the sourdough of the yarn world. I think many of us have discovered multiple new uses for fiber and yarn in this time of the pandemic. So I'm curious about punch needle. I'm starting to gather materials for it. And unlike sewing, I don't want to go into it fearful or doubtful. I would like to go into it studious and open. And I know that there's a lot of great resources out there, and that if I don't add too much noise from my own head, I can just learn and practice and play, which would be nice. I mentioned hand stitching earlier. I'm also interested in that. I do tiny bits of hand stitching at the finish of some sewing projects that I find so simple but so effective. As an example, when you finish sewing on your machine, you typically have thread ends that dangle off, and you can get really nice sharp snips and snip them off. But I actually like threading those thread ends onto a needle and stitching them to the inside of the item, to the side that's not visible, which I feel like it adds a little bit of structure to that end point where the sewing machine stopped. And it's just a bit of tidy finishing, tiny but effective. So I'd love to revisit hand stitching for things like quilting and, putting together a quilt sandwich with a quilt top and batting and backing, and then hand stitching those 3 layers together is very appealing to me. It's one of those things that lives in my head now as a big, scary task, but I'd like to just sweep some of that fear away and enter it a bit more mindfully and be open to the slowness of that. Needle felting was kind of off on a back shelf of thought somewhere. And when I talk about these things, if I'm being honest with you, shame-free zone, friends, I have everything I need here to do everything I just mentioned. I'm really good at collecting the tools and the enthusiasm for a craft. And then the skills typically come later. I am who I am. So I know that if I want to start practicing, if I want to have these kinds of little solo making retreats, I can do it, and the majority will just be not talking myself out of it. I want to encourage this for you as well if it's something that resonates with you. I call these things entering a period of study because I feel like if I think of it as a study, I automatically connect that to a longer time period, which gives me freedom to learn. I connect that to resources. When you study, you typically will be pulling in information from other sources. And I feel like that's a good way to learn and try a thing. And man, are we fortunate to have so much of that available to us. And I also feel that it takes some of the pressure off from my natural instinct to want to be good at it right away. Because when you're studying, you're learning. Then maybe you're doing and you're trying and then you're revisiting. So that mindset of study is something I am embracing as I go. Even that I'm not great at yet. That's all part of it. So I really appreciate you spending time with me as I share this bag project with you and I share my thought process before, during, and after. These reflections mean a lot to me. I like that I have a place to record them, but I really like that I have you to share them with, and that you, I hope, will feel you can share back with me. I'll keep it short this time. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, and you're welcome to visit me again another time. I'll see you then. Bye for now, friends. Mwah.